Welcome to our webinar, Anti-Palestinian Racism, Why It's Being Adopted by Activists and Institutions. I'm Marcy Goldstein, Director of Academic Affairs at JLV, and we are pleased to welcome tonight Richard Marceau, Vice President of External Affairs and General Counsel at the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs in Canada. And also with us is Mika Hackner, our Senior Research Associate at JILV. They will introduce themselves for a few moments, then we'll get into some Q&A, and after about 45 minutes, we're going to welcome questions from the audience.
Richard, you want to start? You go ahead.
Well, thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Mika. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Richard Marceau. I am based in Ottawa and Montreal. You can hear that I am not an English speaker at least as a first language, and I've been joking with my American friends and colleagues that often bad ideas would come from the US to Canada and wreak havoc here, and this time it's the other way around. So there's an idea here in Canada that is making the rounds, and we are exporting it to you. So the goal of this webinar today is to go over this concept of anti-Palestinian racism, how it's been played, how it's playing out here, the context of it, what it means, what it can do, and I'm so grateful that we're going to share the next hour or so together, and happy to answer any question you have.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with us, Mika.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thank you to Marcy for being our moderator tonight, and for Richard for making the time to share his views with us on this. Right, this is a Canadian export. We have them to thank. And yeah, I am the Senior Research Associate at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm really focused on this issue of anti-Palestinian racism. And one thing that I really want to drive home, one idea that I want to emphasize, is that anti-Palestinian racism, they're trying to get it into, or attempting to get it into K through 12 schools in the United States through two doors. The first is through attempting to get training, curriculum changes as a result of complaints to the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights. And the second way is as a response to anti-Semitism training that's happening in K through 12 schools. So if you have someone come in and do an anti-Semitism training, then for balance, they want to bring in an APR, an anti-Palestinian racism training expert. So those are the two mechanisms that I'm seeing in how they're trying to infiltrate K through 12. But I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I'm really looking forward to the audience questions near the end.
Wonderful. Thank you for focusing us. So we're going to start with you, Richard, at the ground level to make sure that everybody knows the basics of what we're talking about and defining our terms. So can you please give us a brief background on the development of the term anti-Palestinian racism, which I think we'll call APR for short, and its definition?
Yes. So this concept was created by a group in Canada called the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. And the goal that they have is very clear. And they're a group that is part of the anti-Israel ecosystem here in Canada. And the goal is the following. It is to dress up the Palestinian narrative into human rights and anti-racism language, because nobody is against race, nobody's for racism, and nobody's against human rights language. So the way they're doing it is basically, if you are in favor of Israel's existence, if connection to Israel is an important part of your identity, you are by definition racist. And that is why it is so vicious, it is so dangerous. It's the new Zionism is racism, but for 2024. It is a way to trafe part of the organized or the mainstream Jewish community, and it is to portray any support of Israel as being racist. And we'll get into the detail as to how it manifested itself so far, but it is an existential threat to Jewish identity in North America today.
Wow. So obviously you've already identified the key problem with it. Is there anything else that you want to elaborate on right now about the main problems with it?
Well, the main problem is that it's being pushed in different institutions. So Mika mentioned K-12. We are seeing it here. We'll get into more details. It's being adopted by unions. It's being adopted and being pushed for by different institutions, mainly on the left. But there's also now an opening with the federal government, and that makes it even more dangerous, because if this concept as a Herrscher, so to speak, a seal of approval from the federal government, from the national government here, it will trickle down in a lot of aspects of Canadian life, and that is dangerous for the Jewish community.
And I just want to jump in and make one point that Dania Majid, who's founder in the which is the group that's really pushing APR, she explicitly said, we chose this name, Anti-Palestinian racism, because it's harder to argue against, right? Everyone knows racism, and if you claim of racism, then institutions have to deal with that claim. So it's a very, I would say, calculated and cynical tactic to call this anti-Palestinian racism, because they know then that institutions have to listen to them, have to take it seriously, have to try and implement it.
Yeah. So Richard, do you think that and Mika, do you think that this definition can be modified and used in any sort of good faith way, or is the idea and definition of it completely problematic and needs to be removed?
Well, so Marcy, that's an interesting question, and in fact, in our meetings with PMO, so the White House, Prime Minister's Office, sorry, I'm trying to make Canadian English clearer, with the Prime Minister's Office and the offices of different ministers, that is the question we're being asked. Because as Mika said, nobody wants to be for racism. So they come to us and say, is there a way to basically square the circle? And our answer is no, for a variety of reasons. A few of them are, it is a concept that is born in sin. It is a concept that was created with the express desire to dress that part of the Jewish identity that is connected with Israel as inherently racist. So that in and of itself makes it difficult. Two, it is a black or white vision of the world. So there's no nuance here. Like, for example, and people ask you, well, how about IRA, the working definition of anti-Semitism from the International Alliance Remembrance, IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance? Isn't it the same thing? And we say no. First of all, IRA has a very clear caveat to it, which says criticism of Israel equal to criticism of other democratic country is not anti-Semitic. They don't have that in the definition that is circulated. And two, what is also quite different is that for the first time the other side, the dark side, I call it, the other side is trying to bring into human rights law something that has never existed before, which is making advocacy for something a protected ground of discrimination. So to speak clearly, if you are discriminated against because you're Jewish or you're Black or you're LGBTQ2+, or you're Asian, that is a clear prohibited ground of discrimination under Canadian Human Rights Act, human rights law. What is not is advocacy for something. There is no legal basis in human rights law in Canada to say if I advocate for something and somebody is against what I'm advocating for, this is a breach of anti-discrimination legislation. And what they're trying to do is to portray that activism as being a protected ground from discrimination. And that is also another reason why APR could not, there's no definition, I believe, that would satisfy the Jewish community.
Very interesting. So that's definitely turning a new corner. I also just wanted to address people who are listening. If you could please add your questions to the chat so that we make sure to see them in time, we would appreciate that. Okay, so I'm just going to reiterate that last point you just made. Mika needs to come back into the webinar. So what you just said is that they are making contesting advocacy the problem.
That is one of the issue that's problematic. You are correct, and I'll go back to their document. So I'm going to give a bit of background because I think it's important. So this idea was launched in the early 2020s, and now it's growing. A couple of years ago, the federal government appointed somebody to be a special reporter or special representative on the issue of Islamophobia. Her name is Amira Al-Gawabi. So she's an officially government appointed person. And in her work against Islamophobia, she is now pushing from the pulpit that was given to her by the Prime Minister of Canada, the idea of anti-Palestinian racism as part of the work against Islamophobia. There is now in the House of Commons, so in Parliament, a study being done both on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And there's a push to include APR into that official report, to which there's an obligation from the federal government to respond. Now, you read the briefs that were sent in, including by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association and a few of their allies, and we'll get back to this in a second. I'm going to read a passage here because I think it circumscribes or it says in a very easy way what the issue is, and I quote: Canada's anti-racism strategy must address the role that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism has played in perpetuating anti-Palestinian racism. Research on anti-Palestinian racism shows that support for Zionism is a key driver of anti-Palestinian racism perpetrated by Zionist organizations in Canada. That is in an official brief that's submitted to the Parliament of Canada. So basically, they are saying the 91% of Canadian Jews who believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East are a bunch of racists, are the bad guys, are the one who are pushing to exclude Palestinians and pro-Palestinian crowds away from the public square. And that is that inversion that is fundamentally wrong with that concept. And that is a direct threat to the heart of Jewish advocacy, of Jewish identity in Canada, and I would submit in the United States as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there particular groups behind the push to get this adopted in Canadian institutions?
So yes, so there's the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association and their fellow travelers. There is Canadian for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which is an anti-Israel group in Canada. Today, attacking my organization, CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, they said, you cannot trust an organization that has Israel in its name. To which my answer on social media said, well, there's at least 22 synagogues in Canada that has Israel in its name. So what does it mean about what you're saying? Two, there is the Canadian equivalent of Jewish Voices for Peace. In Canada, it's called Independent Jewish Voices. It's a group of radical leftists, anti-Israel, that is fueled by hatred of Israel, and that they serve as a very strategic purpose of trying to protect those, I would call it what I think they are, which are haters, protect those haters from accusation of anti-Semitism. IJV represents or tries to represent that fringe of the Jewish community, which in Canada, according to the latest studies, are 3%. There are 3% of Canadian Jews who do not believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. So in terms of what they represent, it's nothing, it's marginal, but they certainly are on the bandwagon of anti-Palestinian racism, and that's the whole ecosystem that is at the root of this. but now it's growing. There are unions that are adopting this and pushing for this. There are churches, liberal churches, who are pushing for this concept as well, and it's trickling down first in the progressive circles, and then they're pushing towards the center, because as Mika said very, very eloquently, nobody wants to be against racism.
Right. Mika, did you want to add something to that?
Oh, sure. So in the American context, there's a relatively new group called the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism that's really trying to push this idea. And they are piggybacking off of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. They use the Hackner definition of anti-Palestinian racism, pretty much the only definition of anti-Palestinian racism going, so they have to use it. And they've come out with a study that claims that APR has wide-ranging mental and physical health impacts. And they note that the majority of people who suffer from this are not themselves Palestinian. Because one of the other things that I really want to drive home here is that Richard was talking earlier about the similarities between IHRA and anti-Palestinian racism, and that IHRA comes with caveats. It's much more narrow, which is true. I disagree with him slightly on whether or not it's a good thing, because APR has been designed to mirror IHRA. So having restrictions on speech in one hand has opened the door to this other restriction, which maybe we can talk about. But they've purposely designed APR to be broad. So the definition is broad, what can constitute anti-Palestinian racism is broad, and then who can suffer from it is broad too. You don't have to be Palestinian to be a victim of anti-Palestinian racism. And so they want to use this study, this 5-minute internet survey that they took out with poorly defined metrics, to prove that APR is an issue that needs to be addressed, particularly in schools. And the people behind the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism are people like Mary Najimi, who had been the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. She's now the founder of the Massachusetts Teachers Association Rank and File for Palestine. She's very active in that space. She was part of that MTA webinar on anti-Palestinian racism, which engaged in a lot of anti-Semitic tropes during that webinar. And Dr. Jess Ganim, who used to be at least an executive committee member of the El Alder Right of Return Coalition. Right? And that coalition believes that basically all refugees have a right to return, and they have a right to live anywhere within what they call Israel, with the exclamation points like that. So they're really trying to push this. And then you have groups, of course, like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and they, along with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and then far-left organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, they've really been leading the charge in trying to get Title VI complaints of anti-Palestinian racism against colleges K through 12 in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And going back to Canada, Richard, you mentioned that there's some interest in unions and some liberal churches. Do you notice any other organizations that are being primed to adopt this and push it?
Well, on campus, we're seeing that, but I want to give like concrete examples of what this concept can cause. First of all, we're talking about training. So we're seeing in unions a desire to train people on APR, so to force feed their members that thing. And two, they will say, "Oh, we're going to do anti-Israel anti-Semitism training," but the people that they would bring in to do this is the IJV people. So to do the anti-Semitism training, they would bring people who are anti-Zionists and on the margin of the Jewish community. So that's tokenism, of course, that's gaslighting the Jewish community. But it's well thought of, right? So you have, we're being fair, we're doing an anti-Semitism training, bringing a group that is very marginal. But if you're rank and file union members, you don't know this, right? So it's, okay, I'm getting training on this side and on that side, so that's fair. So instead of being training, It's actually propagandizing to people who most of them mean well, want to understand better, don't want anybody to be hurt, don't want anybody to be discriminated against. But there's an ideological slant to it, and they're very smart in the way they're doing it. The second thing is it has been used in very, very concrete ways. For example, I don't know about the US, but in many places in Canada, well, actually at the federal level, May is Jewish Heritage Month. In some schools, when there's Sikh Heritage Month or Muslim Heritage Month or whatever, they would have a day that would ask kids to do something. And there was a child in a K-12 setting that for Jewish Heritage Month made a drawing or some kind of artsy project in which there was an Israeli flag in it. And then the school had to take it down because parents complained that it was racist to have an Israel flag there, saying that it was a case of APR. There was also another case where somebody challenged what was being said in a school setting again about the Nakba, the 1948 tragedy that befell the Palestinians. And there's open discussion. There should be open discussions about what happened exactly, but to challenge what was said, they said just to challenge it was in and of itself racist. So it has a chilling effect on a subject that should not be that we should debate, and that's the kind of concrete things that we're seeing now. When the Toronto District School Board, which is the biggest school board in Canada, adopted APR, they sent it to committee to say, okay, so how are we going to do this now? And the TDSB is stuck because they're trying to find a definition that would actually work, but the only one out there is the ACLA one, which in and of itself, as we mentioned at the beginning, is problematic. So they say, okay, so now what? What are we going to do about this? And they're going into a problematic path. And the last thing, and I'm sorry if I speak too much, Mika, but I just want the concept of APR, and I don't know human rights law in the US, but it would be the only type of geographically based discrimination that would be recognized. There's anti-Asian, as I said, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, but there's no such thing as anti-Senegalese racism recognized by authorities. Any I don't know, South African racism type of thing. So it's an entirely new concept that twists human rights law as it's been applied and adopted and used in Canada for decades now.
Yeah. We have the same thing here where they can file Title VI complaints because they can claim that they're being discriminated on the basis of national origin or race, even though Palestinian is. So it's, as you say, it is sort of manipulating tools that are already there in a cynical way. And I just want to drive home that the definition of anti-Palestinian racism is this incredibly broad. So one of the things that is included in the list of anti-Palestinian racism is that if you do not recognize that Israel is a settler colonial state, that is anti-Palestinian racism. If you deny the Nakba, that is anti-Palestinian racism. If you justify violence against Palestinians or equate the actions of the oppressed with the oppressor, that is anti-Palestinian racism. So that we had to say that the founding of the Israeli state is not settler colonialism, rather a story of indigenous people returning to a homeland or being racist. If we say, well, yes, some Palestinians were driven out, others left of their own accord, it's a complicated, messy history that historians are still grappling with, that would be anti-Palestinian racism. If we had to say, actually, defeating Hamas and launching operations to get hostages rescued, we think that's a good thing. Well, you're justifying violence against Palestinians, so that would be anti-Palestinian racism too. And the upshot of this, Richard gave this example in school who just to show his Jewish heritage and include the Israeli flag, is a chilling of speech, not only for teachers and educators, but for Jewish kids, for Jewish students who won't be able to express the very natural connection that they might feel with Israel. So I just wanted to get that spiel in there. But in terms of the focus of which institutions or organizations are being primed to adopt APR, definitely it seems to be that the main drive, the main focus at the moment is colleges and K through. They're the most easily, I think, through these activist cadres within teachers' unions, within student groups. And that seems to be the primary effort of groups like Care that have launched these Title VI complaints against colleges, as well as K through 12 schools. So we're seeing it at Pomona College, for example, and across the country. And in fact, the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism, in a press briefing that they gave a week or two ago, explicitly note that they're going to focus on K through 12, that their next research project is going to be on K through 12 and about why anti-Palestinian racism should be incorporated into curricula and into trainings there.
Wow. Richard, Amira El-Gawabi recently met with Prime Minister Trudeau to urge him to adopt a federal definition of APR. Do you think it's likely going to be adopted?
Well, that's a $1 million question. Just an idea of timing of Canadian political life. So we are now December 5th. Our system our political system is different from the US. There should be parliamentary election maximum by October, but the government could fall before then as the Liberal Party, the party of Prime Minister Trudeau, as a minority in the House. So the question is, will they be adoption before then? I'm not sure. There are two other things that I think should be mentioned here. One is, as we've told the government, the working definition, legally non-binding working definition of anti-Semitism, took more than 20 years to be crafted, to go through levels of legal analysis, of expertise, of diplomatic talks, and it was at an international level. APR is a purely Canadian product. Apologies to American friends, but it's a purely Canadian product that has no scientific or expert analysis made of. So that's one of the points that we're trying to make to the Canadian government. Two, it will depend. Politics being politics, is whether this government see things through a human rights law lens, or seeing this issue through let's call it a stakeholder relations lens. Because if it's a human rights lens, if they're saying, okay, so does this concept make sense? Should we use this? Should we adopt it in Canada? The answer is no, it shouldn't be adopted for all the things that we talked about earlier. If they're seeing it through the lenses of where there's pressure from far left groups, from unions, and from Muslim groups in Canada to adopt it, and in the run-up to an election, the government wants to cater to that to those groups, then there's a possibility of it being adopted. So I'm no prophet. I have no idea where it's going to go. I can tell you that we have an indication that the government is interested in doing so, and it's looking to see if it can be done in the respect or in so that it's conforming to some of its position that it has adopted, including saying that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism in the form of of the support for the IRA definition, and they're trying to see if that's possible.
Right. So it's been adopted by the Toronto District School Board, and that happened When exactly? And I'm wondering if other school boards seem to be on track for adopting it themselves, or is there also any pushback from people outside the Jewish community? I'm curious.
So there's pushback not only from the Jewish community, but it's mainly from the Jewish community. Toronto is home to the biggest Jewish community in Canada, about 200,000 people. There's about 400,000 Jews in Canada. And when the TDSB was having its trustee meeting to debate it, more than 1,000 Jews came out to demonstrate, which in and of itself shows how seriously the Jewish community of Toronto and of Canada takes this issue. There's one other smaller school board that has adopted APR, and it's a definition that is on the surface different from the ACLA definition, but it refers back to the ACLA definition, which, as we talked at the very, very beginning, is problematic. But there are pushes to have not only unions adopted, but there are union pushes to have university administrations adopted, to have provinces adopted, to have the federal government adopted, to have municipalities adopted, and it's a well orchestrated campaign. And on this case, we might be just slightly ahead of the U.S., but it's coming to a theater near you.
Yeah, with all of its unbelievable lack of nuance. So what do you think the consequences would be if this actually comes to fruition?
Are you asking me or are you asking Mika?
Well, I guess I was asking you, but both of you, what would be the consequences for society if this radically unnuanced definition starts gaining traction and permeates society?
Well, it is a part of a broad campaign to trafe mainstream Jewish community and contemporary Jewish identity. Again, I don't know the numbers in the U.S. As I was mentioning earlier, 91% of Canadian Jews support the idea of a Jewish state in the Middle East. So if you're telling 91% of a group, and 6%, so it's 91% agree with this, 3% the anti-Zionists disagree, and there's 6% who don't know. But if you have more than 9 out of 10 Canadian Jews who support the idea of the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East, and that becomes racist, that becomes strafe, that becomes bad, that becomes the incarnation of everything that is bad in the world, that you're trying to exclude an entire group from the public square. You're trying to delegitimize the identity of a group, and that leads to exclusion, that leads to putting people aside, that leads to a form of anti-Semitism that is very, very problematic, because it's a way of saying you don't have the right to talk, because basically your identity should be illegal.
Right, of course. So I'm thinking of Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds: double standard, delegitimization, and demonization, which is exactly what they're doing to Israel, which is a country that obviously exists. So why are you harping and fetishizing and obsessing about this one country, as opposed to, there's hundreds of other countries that have border disputes and other things, but nobody is trying to focus on those countries. And can you also just clarify what you mean by the word trafe? It's such a interesting use of the word. I'm just thinking maybe a few listeners might not get that.
So to make it non-kosher, in effect, to make it something that should not be frequented. That's something that should not be allowed. That's something that should not be accepted. So if a big part of people's identity is made to be bad in and of itself, you're pushing aside an entire group. And I'll make a quick parallel, and I don't want to, because Mika is so smart and so many things to say. I know. If somebody was to say, you know what, we're going to make kosher food illegal because we should not serve kosher food. People will say, well, that's anti-Semitic. That should not be allowed. Where there are more people, again, I'm taking Canadian numbers, but I suspect it's the same thing in the US. There are more Canadian Jews who support Israel, thus who are Zionists, than Canadian Jews who keep kosher. So if part of your core Jewish identity for some Jews is keeping kosher, and making it bad in and of itself it's a no-go. Why is it that something that's even more supported, even more important for Canadian Jewish identity, why making it bad or treif or quasi-illegal, why would it be acceptable? It is not up to non-Jews to define what is important to Jews. It is not up to non-Jews to define what's important for the identity, for Jewish identity. It's up to Jews to self-define, and it's up to human rights law to respect and protect Jewish identity, however way a Jew defines it.
Right. I also just want to jump in and say that a broader effect of this, beyond just the Jewish community, is the chilling impact on education and the chilling impact on speech. How can you have a class on the Israel-Palestinian conflict when you can only then give one narrative, right? How can you have any sort of intellectual debate? So this is impacts for broader society beyond just the Jewish community.
Yeah, it's an example of pedagogy gone bad.
Oh, I mean, it's a prime example.
Yeah,
but here it's just a quick difference here in terms of legal system. So in the U.S., you have the First Amendment, freedom of speech. We have constitutionally protected freedom of speech in Canada, although built in that right is a clause, Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, that allows reasonable limits in a free and democratic society. That's how it's written in the Canadian Constitution. So there are limits that are allowed under Canadian constitutional law, and there's a very, very rigorous test to see if that's if the limit is reasonable in a free and democratic society. But what we're saying is that this type of concept is actually, like APR, is not something that would be reasonable in a free and democratic society.
right. And I just want to remind our audience to please post your questions, as we're just about halfway through at this point. And I'll ask you now, Richard and Mika, what methods to challenge APR do you think are going to be most useful?
I think we have to get back to bedrock liberal principles, bedrock principles of freedom of speech and freedom of debate. I don't think that, a sort of a tit-for-tat approach, getting more anti-Semitism trainings into schools or is necessarily going to help, because all it really has done is open the door for these activists to come in the first place and add fuel to a fire. I think if we have to get back to a place where we can say all ideas should be debated, all should be discussed openly, and the merits openly, and we shouldn't circumscribe what goes on in the classroom and what students can and cannot say.
Classic liberalism.
That's me.
Yeah. Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with Mika that it's a battle of ideas. Again, our human rights law and our constitution was different from the U.S., but bottom line is, I agree, it's a battle of ideas. It's fighting censorship. It is making sure that people are free to express not only free speech but who they are, and to show that this attempt to silence an entire group of people is possibly the most anti-democratic push that I've seen in a long time in North America.
Yeah, it really is very shocking. Why do you think it has begun in Canada, of all places? Like, why Canada?
Great question.
There's a solid pro-Palestinian movement in Canada. There is an important and growing Muslim population in Canada. which is very sympathetic to the Palestinians. There, as I was mentioning, there's about 400,000 Jews in Canada, 1.5 million Muslims in Canada. So, demography speaks. It's in a democracy, votes are, political parties want vote, and certainly in Canada, it is possibly the most unifying factor for the Muslim community, the Palestinian cause. We have Muslims from Indonesia, from Pakistan, from North Africa, from all around the world, and they're very, very different in terms of practice, in terms of national outlook, in terms of ideology. But there's one thing that unifies them. It is the pro-Palestinian cause, and they're using it as one way to flex their political muscles. And two, we also have to be honest here. It's not easy to be Palestinian. What they're going through in Gaza is horrible. What Hamas brought to them is unfathomable. It's horrible. It's a human tragedy. And in and of itself, when you're sitting in your TV room in Montreal or Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, and you see those images day in, day out, and you how can you not feel that? And if if you don't want anybody to hurt, nobody wants, no human being wants other innocent human beings to hurt. So when this idea comes out, say, okay, so it's a way of showing or understanding and being empathic with what the Palestinian community is living, both in the Middle East and here in North America. So we, lots of people are empathic, and it's hard not to sympathize with this. But the issue is that the anti-Israel crowd is using that fuel, that sympathy, that empathy for Palestinians against the Jewish community. And that's the main problem. Like, it should not be a zero-sum game. You should be able to say, I support Israel's right to exist and live in peace, and Palestinian national, legitimate national aspiration. You should be able to say, I do not want Palestinians to live, to be discriminated against, and I do not want Jews to be discriminated against. And the issue of that black and white vision, of that oppressor oppressed, of that Jews oppressor in the Middle East because they have Israel with a powerful army, but also oppressor here in Canada, thus in the United States, and thus also the bad guys, is not conducive to keeping social cohesion in North America. The US and Canada are possibly, with Australia, the most diverse nations on the planet. And we have a successful model. No model is perfect. But compared to every other model, I'd say, pretty good. And there's a reason why so many people from all around the world want to come to our countries. But to be able to do this, we need to go to not accept that black and white vision that APR is a symptom of.
Yeah, it's offensive to the core of who we pride ourselves to be. Mika, did you want to add anything about which groups are trying to push APR to be adopted in American schools or institutions?
So I think I already mentioned the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism. Mm-hmm. They're a key group that is pushing it. CARE is pushing it. Palestine Legal is pushing it. But then you have all of these activist teachers and within the teachers' unions who are pushing it too. I think we should expect to see a lot more of this coming. We already know that there's 2 Title VI complaints against Berkeley Unified School District in California and the Santa Clara Unified School District in California that is going to be investigated. Mm-hmm. And they are demanding, sort of as a remediation, they're demanding that we allow anti-training, that we have curricula that includes anti-Palestinian racism, that schools make public apologies. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is getting people from the Institute for Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism into schools to give trainings to balance out the anti-Semitism training. And that happened last October in Balboa High School in San Francisco, where the anti-Palestinian racism training was mandatory for all teachers. And that's where they were told, Jews are... So there was a question in the chat about, would APR cover Jews who lived under British Mandate Palestine? And the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism would say yes, because things could have been Muslim, could have been Jews, could have been Christians. That's why we're indigenous to the land and not these separatists. Right? So they're trying to sort of erase and shift history in an ahistorical way. Yeah, but those are the main groups.
Right. So I see some interesting questions in the chat here. Do you think that we should add new terms such as anti-Jewish racism or anti-Israel racism to trainings, or is that just a slippery slope to nowhere?
I have really strong feelings about this. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Mika, please.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea. I think it's. We shouldn't play the identity politics game. It becomes zero sum. It weakens the fabric of a society that should be built around liberal values. It's not working, and as I say, the more you have these trainings, the more it opens the door for activists to say, well, to these people, why don't you give place to us? I think we need to have a real shift in the way that we think about this, and the way that we approach this. And so, for my mind, I would rather have no.
You'd rather have what?
To my mind, I'd rather we have no trainings at all. Why are teachers having mandatory trainings on anti-Semitism or anti-Palestinian racism? Teach, right? Teach English, teach maths, teach science. Why are we bringing politics into the classroom? That's my view, my personal view. Maybe Richard has a different perspective.
Well, so Marcia, I find your question fascinating because actually we were talking about this earlier today. If APR was to be adopted, now every group will have the same thing: the anti-Senegali racism and anti-Afghani racism, and you would have one group after another. And maybe our viewers would be interested to know that there were, I believe, 2 or 3 articles in the Jewish Review of Books, 2 or 3 editions ago about a concept called anti-Israelism. Food for thought. Certainly something that came up again today in our discussion here, because I think if APR is adopted, other groups will follow, and will the Jewish community want to go and follow suit, saying, well, if they have it, we should have it too, because if that's the game we're playing, we should all be playing. That might be a possibility that some members of the Jewish community will push for. Where I agree with Mika is that it is a cul-de-sac. It makes no sense policy-wise. It does not help social cohesion. It does not help national cohesion. That's a dead end. That's a cul-de-sac, to use a French term. And there are other ways to fight bigotry, to fight racism, to fight discrimination than those concepts.
Yeah, I think some research is coming out now that shows that some of these trainings are actually exacerbating divisions. So,
of course it is. When you divide people by identity characteristics,
right.
It's human nature to, it's so of course these just gonna sort of, because you're teaching people that the pie is finite and that there's only slices, and you be with your group in order to get a slice. Of course, it's going to ruin social cohesion.
Right. I think a bunch of us have been talking about this for a few years, but now there's some measurable studies coming out, and JLV is actually leading another webinar about this in a few days that I hope people tune into.
So I will, because I'm not sure I agree with Mika on this. So I don't think the concept of training in and of itself is bad. I guess it's the content of it. So please, Mika and Marcy, please send me the link because Instead of talking, I'll be listening.
Yeah, wonderful.
So good plug, Marcy. Thank you.
Yeah. So if we continue some of these trainings, maybe not forcing teachers, maybe they should be optional, like maybe there's some kind of middle ground to these trainings. How should they be reformed? Like what other foundational approach can we go with other than dividing people by skin color? There's obviously many other approaches other than that. That is a dead end. So what reformations do you think we could use for the trainings that will inevitably happen? Hopefully not in a way that's force feeding it to people, but maybe they can choose to attend some of these trainings as continuing ed units or, whatever.
So Mika, maybe it's more for you.
Like a pluralistic sort of approach. I know there's other ways to help knit our societies to get our people in society together other than this one unnuanced binary that seems to have become quite fashionable, that is maybe shifting out because of proven lack of success, that is now becoming more publicized in the news.
So the black and white binary version of the world is one that I completely disagree with. I though now Jewish, I was not born Jewish, and I come from Quebec City where there were 200 Jews. I would have liked to know what Jews were and what anti-Semitism is. I learn every day about the terrible experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada and how they are still to this day discriminated against. People that the groups that in the U.S. I believe you call Native Americans. We have different names for the first, we call them First Nation, Métis, and Inuit nations here in Canada. I believe there's place for this. The question is not if. To me, the question is more the how, and I suspect that on this, Mika and I might disagree, and maybe even with you, Marcy. But I think that there's place for debate here, and maybe we could come to a way that would make our society better in a way that is not, top-down, Marxist-inspired, type of ideology that's being force-fed to too many of us here now.
Mm-hmm. Maybe an approach is to celebrate all Indigenous people, and have that be the groundwork, because anti-Zionism is basically anti-Indigenous, but most people don't know that. So maybe one way to reform some of these trainings is just to start with that as a foundation.
But careful, Marcy, because just by saying that, you're guilty of APR.
Yep.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Very tricky.
Yeah.
So what about Holocaust studies training? That has been a very tricky thing for us to deal with here in America, because sometimes it can inadvertently create little Nazis in the classroom. Maybe that's a place that we could also look to reform the training.
I really think that all students would benefit from having to read The Wave. I don't know if you guys had to read that when you were in school, but I think what's happening now in schools, they could all benefit from reading The Wave. I think that Holocaust education has not been approached correctly historically. I think it doesn't show the lead up to it. It doesn't show what fascism is and how fascism developed. Excuse me, and why Nazism was appealing to people. I think putting it in that kind of broader context would be useful. I also feel as if universalizing the Holocaust has weakened the way that we teach about it. So I think that there are major problems with the way the Holocaust in schools. Like one little section on snippet of history, which portrays sort of victims and objects, and then we get into sort of genocide and how it became. I think it's a problem.
So, Marcia, a few things about Holocaust education. I agree with Mika when she talked about the problems of universalizing the Holocaust and the lessons of the Holocaust. To me, there are two aspects of the Holocaust, and just for the record, when I was a member of Parliament, I tabled the bill that made Yom HaShoah an official recognized day in Canada, and so there are two lessons to the Holocaust. One is the universalistic lesson, yes, the othering of a group and what it can lead to, but it's also a very specifically Jewish event. So we're seeing now a bit of erasure of the Jewish aspect of Holocaust education, which to me is very troubling. Two, there's the issue of decontextualizing, and here again I would agree with Mika. There's a lead up to it, that if it's not, so if the Holocaust education is not done properly, there's a problem. And the third thing is, and here is the famous book by Dara Horn, People Love Dead Jews. I've seen two, and call me cynical, but being in and around politics for so long now, people do love dead Jews, and too many people who, excuse me, don't necessarily care that much about Jews would come up to Holocaust remembrance events and say, "See, I'm not anti-Semitic. I've been there." But when Jews stand up, when Jews fight back, when Jews do not take it lying down, now they criticize Israel, they criticize the Jews, and say, "Well, I'm not anti-Semitic because I was there at that Yom HaShoah or Holocaust Remembrance Day event at wherever, and I lit a candle." So to hide behind Holocaust remembrance and then not caring about live Jews has been also a problem in Canada.
Right. So in closing, other than reading the book People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn, what advice would you give to people to use this information, this shocking information, to make things better? And how can our communities in our two countries collaborate to build more partnership to help each other and get ahead of the curve of this, growing crisis?
So two things. The short answer would be don't adopt it. That's my advice to my American friends. But two, jokes aside, I've sent to Mika some documents about APR, what it is, some of the arguments against it. Be ready, organize. You in the US, as in Canada, you live in a democracy. Speak up. Don't be bullied. Don't let the other side organize. Don't sleep on the switch while this is being organized, because if you don't fight back, if you don't not only don't fight back, but if you don't prevent it before it's adopted, the problems will be bigger. So stop it before it's adopted. I have a very, very deep admiration for the Jewish community of the U.S. You are a smart, organized, strategic group. Yes, I know. I see all the problems, and we have ours too. So you're not perfect. Sorry to tell you, neither are we. But there's enough smart in your community to make sure that that APR, that threat to contemporary North American Jewish identity, does not take root in this great country that is the United States of America.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I think you've said it perfectly. Don't be afraid of the title. So don't be afraid. They call it anti-Palestinian racism for a reason. They want you not to argue back. Don't be afraid to argue back. Don't accept the premises of the definition. If you're seeing that a training is going to happen, look at who is giving that training, and then ask your institution, hey, why is this happening? Why did you contract with these people? If you see that it's coming into your kids' curriculum, you have every right to question that and push back, and organize at the grassroots level. Absolutely. And I think that's something that we're learning from Canada when it comes to APR. be vocal and organize.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for this wonderfully fruitful conversation. We're looking forward to collaborating more and helping in the other direction as well. Canada has informed us about what's coming down the pike, and we also want to reciprocate and to support the Jewish community there. Thank you to everybody listening. We have contact information on our website, jilv.org. And how should people best get in touch with you, Richard?
Say that again?
How should people best get in touch with you and your organization?
info@cija.ca.
Okay.
Right. I just want to say thank you so much to Richard for doing this with us and for sharing your vast knowledge and expertise. And thank you, Marcy, for asking such great questions.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you both. Good night.
Thank you.